What's up, everyone? We are back once again this season with our picks against the spread series every single week, or at least most every single week. I didn't get to do any on the channel for week one because I was super behind trying to make that three-part prediction series. That ended up being way longer than I thought it would be, so I didn't have time to do any picks for week one on the channel. If you're a patron, you got all the picks on Patreon, but in terms of just for the channel, didn't get to do any. So to make up for that, I'm releasing 3 picks against the spread videos on the channel this week for week 2's games, starting with this one, releasing 2 more later on today into tonight, so you can kind of catch up on all those before kickoff tomorrow. And I am doing a little bit differently this year than I have in the past. On suggestion from one of my patrons, you know, they said instead of kind of moving through 3 games quickly and kind of giving us a shotgun volume picks against the spread for the week, you know, why don't you kind of slow it down, focus on one game, go through every single detail of that game, expand on it in all the nitty-gritty detail of matchups I'm looking at, schemes that I'm looking at, injuries, how they're affecting certain matchups and schemes, and really open up all my thoughts on one individual game so I can kind of give some insight on the process of how I handicap every single week and why I'm picking certain ways. So I really like that idea. I think it's going to be a little bit more insightful than just me rifling off picks. You know, maybe we can kind of learn something about these matchups together. So again, really great suggestion. So we're going to start off this 3-part, I guess you could call it, week 2 pick series by talking about one of the games that I'm most looking forward to this week, and that is Vikings at Packers. As of the time of me recording this, Packers are favored by 2.5. That line has held steady for the last few days. I expect it to hold all the way through kickoff at 2.5. Maybe by the time you watch this, it may have shifted a little bit depending on how bets are coming in, but it'll probably still be at about 2.5. And I'm taking that. I think the Packers are going to cover and not just win, but win by at least a field goal. You know, looking at some of these injuries, I don't want to say they're key injuries, but Mackenzie Alexander being out is kind of a big deal for them because Mike Hughes still isn't back. So right now the secondary is pretty much Xavier Rhodes and Trey Waynes, and that's about it. There's a whole bunch of guys behind them that we haven't really seen play a whole lot. You know, there's Mark Fields, there's Chris Boyd, Nate Meters. Like we're not really sure, or at least not sure enough to be confident in any of them as a nickelback here. So that is kind of a matchup that might hurt Minnesota. Pat Elflein being questionable. If he doesn't play, honestly, that's not a huge deal because I don't think Pat Elflein's very good. There's a decent chance that, like, if Brett Jones gets a shot at left guard, maybe Drew Samia, Dozier, like whoever they put in as his backup, assuming he doesn't play, that kind of might be addition by subtraction, to be perfectly honest. So that isn't really an injury that hurts them. But the Alexander injury definitely does hurt them. And the Packers are still relatively healthy. Bakhtiari was questionable, I think, with a back issue this week, but he should play. If it kind of flares up during the game, obviously that's going to change a lot. And I think that's part of the reason why this line maybe isn't a little bit higher, because a Bakhtiari injury would be major for them. But he should play. And then the only other starter who I think is not going to be playing is Oren Burks, who plays next to Blake Martinez in their nickel package. So you'll probably see a lot more dime from Green Bay again this week like we saw last week. But overall, both teams are mostly healthy. At most, they're only going to be down 1 starter apiece. So it's not like there's any major injuries to account for here. And so really what it comes down to is scheme and personnel matchups. And again, I think that's where Green Bay has the advantage. When you look at the Packer run defense, they are way more disciplined and they match up personnel-wise way better than Atlanta. Minnesota was able to catch the Falcons in week 1 with some weak edges, which allowed a couple big runs because Atlanta didn't have any corner force against strong slot formations out of 21 personnel, which is a thing you're going to see a lot from the Vikings this year. So they would kind of put both receivers on one side to move the corner out of the way, so then you didn't really have a true edge defender on the line of scrimmage, or at least if you did, it was something that the fullback had a good angle on to kind of help turn it back inside for the tight end to seal, and the fullback would keep on going to the strong safety. So it kind of really stressed their edge run defense to the limit because they didn't have a corner force there. And Keanu Neal, who was the guy to play force in that scenario, he just wasn't getting off blocks on the second level. Whether it was fullback or tight end, he wasn't beating blocks. So that was a major problem for them. But Green Bay isn't the same. They're going to be playing more zone than Atlanta did because they were surprisingly pretty man heavy in that game. They're going to be playing more zone, so you are going to have to deal with more corner force looks, which means it's harder to get to the edge. And even when they do play man, I still think they're going to be using their outside linebackers a little bit wider than Atlanta did. So they're going to be setting a hard edge and forcing everything back inside to Clark and Martinez anyway. So on the whole, I'm just not really concerned about how that zone stretch run game matches up with Green Bay. I think Green Bay matches up very well with them. And on top of that, speaking of Kenny Clark at nose tackle, he's one of the very best nose tackles in the league, if not the best, which mitigates a lot of the effectiveness of Minnesota's zone run game all by itself, which is reliant on having a good center matchup. Kind of speaking in generalization about the zone run game, I highlighted Garrett Bradbury repeatedly in the offseason, and again on Twitter this past week, I posted some videos of him against Atlanta, and kind of how having a dominant zone run center is so important to the zone run game, because if you don't have a center, the zone run game can't work. Like, they call it the pivot position because that style of run literally pivots around the center. And if you don't have a center that can really excel on reach blocks and creating that lane to pivot around, the whole system just completely falls apart. If you want to kind of a longer example, go to the Jason Kelce film room episode I posted, was it like a month and a half ago, and kind of showing how having a dominant zone center like Jason Kelce completely opens up that run game. It was the same kind of thing for Garrett Bradbury. Like, that zone run game worked because they drafted Garrett Bradbury, and he was dominating inside as a run blocker. Pretty much everybody whose name wasn't Grady Jarrett. Everybody else was getting manhandled by this dude in the run game. And so kind of looking at the Clark versus Bradbury matchup, which I think is going to be determining the success of the Vikings run game overall, I think Clark wins that matchup. Because not only is he more powerful than Bradbury, but he's extremely quick for his size too. And so if you can win that nose versus center matchup, like, that is monumental to not just kind of shutting down the Vikings run game, but also shutting down their pass game, because their pass game is built off their run game. So, that matchup by itself, I think, is huge in this game, and it's a matchup that I think favors Green Bay. If Bradbury, and this is a big if Bradbury is able to kind of at least hold his own against Clark, that can kind of swing this game. But just knowing what we know about Kenny Clark being an all-pro caliber defensive tackle, I don't expect Bradbury to be able to beat him in his second career game. That would be unrealistic to me. And so really what we're left with is Kirk Cousins, Stephon Diggs, and Adam Thielen against the Green Bay secondary, because the run game is going to be very inconsistent. Like, if they're going to move the ball, I think it's going to be through the air, just because I don't expect Dalvin to be that effective. And I think, again, that matchup it's tough for Minnesota, because Jair Alexander, is one of the best young corners in the game that nobody talks about. And he matches up very well with Stephon Diggs, who is not just a deep threat, but a really, really, really good route runner, great hands. But Alexander is so quick and so fluid that he's able to kind of mirror and match the quote-unquote great route runners of the league that are really more built on quickness and technique than just raw size and speed. And so Alexander matches up with those kind of receivers very well, because he's not a big guy himself, but again, he's just so damn quick that no matter how good you are out of your breaks, Alexander's going to be right on top of you. He's just got phenomenal feet, great technique. So again, this is hard for me to say, because I love Stephon Diggs. He's one of my favorite receivers in the whole league. But if I was going to be just putting them on an island against each other, I would probably favor Alexander. He's very, very underrated at the corner spot. And so really the only problem for Green Bay, if we think that Kenny Clark and Preston Smith and Za'Darius Smith are going to shut down Dalvin Cook, and we think that Jair Alexander is going to shut down Stephon Diggs, really the only problem for Green Bay is going to be Adam Thielen against either Tramon Williams or Kevin King, or maybe a little bit of Darnell Savage if he bumps down into the slot against 21 personnel looks. Like, that's a possibility too. So I think Thielen wins that matchup regardless of who's covering him, whether it's Williams, King, or even Savage. If he does go against Savage, I think he's got the size to kind of bully him a little bit, because he's one of the big kind of premier big slot receivers in the league, right up there with, I guess Michael Thomas would be the other one that first comes to mind. And Thielen he is definitely a very physical receiver. He's tough over the middle. He catches everything thrown to him. So I think that's a positive matchup for him. And I think he's also just quicker than Tramon Williams at Tramon's age. Williams, I think, is very smart, especially in zone. He's always right where he needs to be. But if they go man, let's say Minnesota uses a lot of 11 personnel in this game compared to 21, which is what they used last week. If they go more 11 and you've got Tramon isolated against Adam Thielen in the slot, I'll take Thielen all day. Just from a pure athleticism standpoint, it's a 36-year-old corner against one of the 10 best receivers in the league. That's just, in terms of physical traits at this point in both of their careers, I would probably favor Thielen. Like, the dude is way underrated in terms of athleticism. He's exceptionally quick. Everybody knows how good of a route runner he is, but part of the reason why he's such a great route runner is because he's so explosive in short areas, and I just don't think Williams is going to be able to keep up with him. Kevin King is the kind of athlete that can keep up with Adam Thielen, but again, if they're hiding him in the slot and you got King outside facing whoever their third receiver is in 11 personnel, I would expect him to probably match up more with Tramon Williams. So again, that is the matchup that if Minnesota was going to have any offensive success in this game, I think that's the way they're going to do it, is really isolating Thielen in whatever ways they can get him isolated and then exploiting that. So overall, I give the edge to the Packers defense. They are built a lot better to stop the Vikings run game than Atlanta ever was, because I think Atlanta their run defense is a mess. And they have a young, fast secondary that I think can at least limit that excellent receiving core as well. Not totally shut them down, but at least limit it to the point where it's going to be tough for them to keep up with Aaron Rodgers. Truth be told, I think Green Bay holds them under 20 points. I really do, just because the matchups all across the board, other than Thielen in the slot and maybe Dalvin Cook in the receiving game, if they can isolate him on Blake Martinez, all of the matchups other than those two favor Green Bay. So again, I would say that they probably hold them to 20 points or less. And then when it comes to the Packer offense against the Vikings defense, Minnesota, like I mentioned earlier, is banged up a bit already, with Alexander being out of this game with the elbow injury, Mike Hughes still not being fully back from the ACL, Gideon's battling a groin. He's not technically a starter unless they start in base. Most of the time they start in nickel, but he's a key piece of their base defense when they leave nickel. So if we see a lot of 21 or 12 personnel from Green Bay, him not being on the field is going to hurt them a little bit, especially in their run defense. So, the Vikings secondary right now is Rhodes and Waynes, and then whoever they put in the nickel spot, with Alexander out, which I'm not 100% sure if that's going to be Boyd or Fields this week. So to me, like there's a good chance that we see Geronimo Allison, being the most heavily targeted receiver on the Green Bay side. Like, that would not shock me at all, just because he's got the most advantageous matchup. I happen to like Allison as a receiver, by the way. Like, that is an advantage for Green Bay, because I do think, again, as a bigger slot receiver, he's a little bit more underrated. He doesn't get the pub that Davante Adams does, and he's certainly not as gifted as Marquez Valdes-Scantling, but I think Aaron Rodgers depends on him. He runs good routes. They have good chemistry. I think this is a decent, like, if you're playing daily, kind of a side note, if you're playing daily fantasy, this is a decent matchup to play Allison at a huge value, just because he's got a very favorable matchup, and I would not be shocked if he gets like 7 or 8 targets, maybe even 9 in this game, just because of that matchup. Like, Aaron's not shy to spread the ball around. He's not just going to feed Davante Adams because Davante is the number one. He's going to feed whoever's open, and I think Allison's going to be open. And here's a thought, by the way, as well. Speaking of the nickelback situation for Minnesota, if they kick Valdes-Scantling inside for a few snaps and take some shots from the slot to him, where he can just outrun whatever backup nickel corner Minnesota has in the game, who also will probably be smaller than him too, that's a matchup I like even more than Allison. Because we've seen LaFleur call some deep overs and slot fades, or even just straight up like go balls from the slot. Like, he's called that before, back when he was in Tennessee. So that's something that I really would be watching tomorrow, because Valdes-Scantling, in terms of just like a size speed matchup, he's the most physically gifted receiver on that team, even over Davante Adams. So if I was LaFleur, If I saw a backup nickel corner in the game that is not as big or as fast as Valdez-Scantling, and I know that he's going to be playing outside leverage in that system to carry him up the seam, I would do whatever I could to just straight up run him up that number 2 seam and then try to draw the free safety the other way with a seam ball in the number 1 seam, create some sort of impossible situation for Anthony Harris to deal with back there, where if he's taking Rudolph, he leaves MVS one-on-one with a nickelback who's slower than that. There's a lot of options here, I think, to attack this defense. Obviously, Mike Zimmer's defensive system has worked for a long time, but I think if you know that they're going to be playing match zone, you know that they're going to be playing single high for a majority of the game, and you know that if they're automatically going to be carrying those seams with the nickelback, and the nickelback can't run with your slot receiver, I would be stunned if they don't take at least one shot to Valdez-Scantling out of that alignment this game, because it's too perfect. It's way too perfect. Allison will be playing the majority of the snaps in there, and I think getting the majority of the targets, but just if they need a big play, putting MVS inside and saying, just go run your ass off, that could be a very, very key play for them. So, again, look out for that. And then also, speaking of that Rhodes and Adams matchup, which I've danced around a little bit while talking about this game, Adams is one of the few receivers that has given Xavier Rhodes problems consistently since he entered the league. And I think, when you look at Xavier Rhodes against Julio Jones last week, he really does well against Julio Jones because he's such a big, long, strong athlete, and Julio just struggles to get away from him off the line. But Davante Adams, I think, has a better, more slippery release off the line than Julio does. Julio's obviously, bigger, stronger, faster in a straight line, but just in terms of lateral quickness, and just being almost impossible to get your hands on in press. Davante Adams is one of the slipperiest receivers in the league off the line of scrimmage, right up there with, I would say, Keenan Allen and Amari Cooper. All of them are just so damn hard to bump. And so that's really what's given Xavier Rhodes, problems in the past, is if he can't get his hands on Davante immediately in the route, Davante is able to dictate the rest of the route to him. He's able to capitalize on that leverage immediately. And if you can kind of out-leverage Rhodes and get him in a spot that you want him to be, there's nothing he can do about it. So Davante has given him problems in the past because he's so damn good at the line of scrimmage, and that's where Rhodes wins, is at the line of scrimmage. So I think he even caught a touchdown against Xavier last year. So I would expect Adams to again give him problems this year just because he always does, which then overall makes me think that the Green Bay receiving core has an advantage against the Minnesota secondary. If Green Bay's number 1, I think, can beat Minnesota's number 1, which we've seen in the past, if Green Bay's number 2 can beat Minnesota's number 2, Trey Waynes, I think, is a good speed matchup for Marquez Valdez-Scantling, but if he kicks inside, they don't have a single nickelback on the team, including Mackenzie Alexander, that can run with him. So I would say Green Bay's number 2 has an advantageous matchup as well. And then when they do go into 11 and you got Geronimo Allison inside, again, I would say that's an advantageous matchup for them as well, just because they're down 2 nickelbacks to start the year. So overall, again, I would say Green Bay's receiving core has the advantage. And that, I think, is going to be the difference in the game. That would be why I have Green Bay covering at 2.5, because I think they'll actually be able to move the ball up and down the field, whereas Minnesota might be a little bit less consistent, other than when they're targeting Adam Thielen. So it's going to be a very narrow margin. If I was going to predict a score, I would say Green Bay 20, Minnesota 17. Just because these are both very talented teams with 2 good quarterbacks. And yes, I will defend Kirk Cousins until the day I die. I do think he's a good quarterback, but he's clearly not Aaron Rodgers. So on a day when I expect both run games to struggle, not be terrible, but at least struggle, I do think this is going to be a very, very tight game, a very physical game too. That Green Bay pulls out just by the narrowest of margins, with a field goal to cover the spread, probably a field goal very late to cover the spread. I think it's going to be a hugely entertaining game, a lot of great defensive football, a lot of really interesting one-on-one matchups for both secondaries. I really can't wait to watch it. So Again, I do think Green Bay covers that 2.5 spread, and I kind of want to touch on some of these prop bets too, solely for this game, since we are talking about all things Vikings-Packers. The over-under is 43. Obviously, I'm going with the under because I think it's going to be 20-17. So I would expect the score to be somewhere between like 37 to 40 points total between two teams, which hits the under. So count me in for the under. For over-under for Aaron Rodgers touchdown passes, that's at 1.5. I'm taking the over. I think he throws 2, one to Devontae Adams, another to MVS, probably on one of these 40-plus yard bombs that I'm talking about. The over-under for Kirk Cousins touchdown passes is 1.5. I'm also going the over on that one. I think he throws 1 to Thielen and another to Kyle Rudolph down in the red zone. Maybe if they can kind of get him matched up against a smaller safety like Amos or Savage, I think that's a decent matchup for them. Over-under for Dalvin Cook rushing yards is 78.5. I'm going with the under for that one. Not by much. I think he rushes for about 70, but still that's the under nonetheless. And for Aaron Jones, the over-under is at 58.5. I'm going with the over on that one. I think he rushes for about the same as Dalvin, probably about 70, maybe 75 yards if he can break off a couple decent carries, which should clear the over-under. Not a spectacular day, but still, it'll clear the over. And then finally, we got the receiving yardage props for Adams, Thielen, and Diggs. I'm taking the over for Adams at 77.5. I think he's going to have some success against Rhodes for sure. Probably catch a couple balls against man to crack 80, I would expect in this game. Probably not hit 100, but I do think he'll crack 80. It won't be on a whole lot of catches, maybe like 5 total, 2 of which are against Xavier. But if he can get a couple against Xavier's man coverage and then grab a few more on zone beaters or like a deep cross off a bootleg or something like that, I think he can hit that over just fine. He's probably not going to have a huge day, but I still think he's going to get more than 77.5. And for Diggs, his over-under is at 60.5. I'm taking that over as well. He's got a really tough assignment against Jair Alexander, as I mentioned before. But with a guy like Diggs, really all it takes is one catch for him to rip off like 40 or 50 yards, which we saw late in that Falcons game as well. He was quiet. Next thing you know, he's got a 35-yard on a deep over. So I'm banking on him generating at least one big play in this game and then filling in like 10 or 15 yards throughout the rest of the game to hit that over. I don't think he'll have a lot of catches, maybe like 3, maybe 4, but he doesn't need a lot of catches to get that magic 61-yard number, so I'm going with him to hit that over. And then finally, Thielen, he's sitting at 70.5, I believe, for the over. Yeah, 70.5. I think he hits that. I think he's going to have the most favorable matchup of all the Minnesota receiving options against either Tramon Williams or Kevin King or Darnell Savage. I think he gets fed the ball early and often, and he ends up as the only receiver in the whole game for either team over 100 yards. I also think he's going to be one of the only receivers. Maybe Allison can hit it as well to catch at least 7 balls in this game, which would put him over his 6-catch over-under as well, just as a side note. So Thielen, I think, is going to be the most productive receiver in the game because he's got the best matchup. And that's how I see this game going. 2 lackluster rushing performances, 2 inconsistent but still explosive passing games, plenty of passing yardage, but not an overwhelming amount of points scored. I think both defenses tighten up in the red zone significantly. Green Bay wins by a field goal in a tight, physical, back and forth, highly entertaining game, and they take a well-earned lead in the NFC North after starting their season with back-to-back divisional game wins. Really, really can't wait for this game. I think it's going to be amazing to watch. And if you do want to bet on any of these things that I brought up today, whether it's the over-under, the spread, the prop bets, anything like that, whether you agree or disagree with me, you can kind of put your money where your mouth is and head on down to that link in the description to take you to MyBookie and enter promo code Brett to give you a 100% deposit bonus on your first deposit up to $1,000. And what that's going to do is, as you bet your initial deposit, they will give you a 100% bonus on it, effectively doubling your deposit. And anything you win with that free deposit credit, you just get to keep. It's real money that you get to win and you get to keep, and then you can keep betting with it, you can withdraw it, you can do whatever you want. So it greatly increases your potential earnings because you're betting with literal house money. And if you feel strongly about these week 2 games, especially this one, if you feel strongly that it's going to be a shootout, you want to bet the over. If you think the Vikings run game is going to continue dominating on the road, and Dalvin Cook is going to go off in this game, feel free to bet that way. If you agree with me that Green Bay's defense is a whole different beast this year, is going to shut them down, I encourage you to bet that way either. But no matter what you bet, that 100% deposit bonus will essentially make your bet for free. So it's a really, really great offer. It's not going to be there all year, so get on it while you can. Again, 100%, literally double deposit bonus on your first deposit up to $1,000. Hit that link in the description, take you to mybookie.ag, our season-long sponsor. Enter promo code Brett, and that will get you that bonus. Really, really thank them for sponsoring all of these pick videos this season, and of course, all of our film room episodes every single week. I will be back later today with 2 more pick videos expanding on individual games as much as I possibly can. The first one I think I'm going to be doing is Falcons hosting Philly in a very intriguing offensive matchup. I think that one's going to have a lot more points involved than people think. So, again, can't wait to get into that game. I'll be back later today with another pick breakdown. Hope you guys enjoy that, and I'll see you in a little bit. Later.